What's with that?
They say wealth is wasted on the old.
Yeah, probably, right? Well, if they can't enjoy it, what good is it, right? They just crack me up. Well, we finished the 8th chapter of Romans, and probably there is so many really neat things in that into the 8th chapter, especially the last 2 verses. And I won't go back over them. Well, maybe I'll mention something really quickly. Let's look at 38 and 39 really quickly, just in a little more detail. Because this literally sums up the logos to telos that is in that 8th chapter. As I've shown you before, when you look at, let's say Romans itself. Romans is a logos to telos. So the whole thing is a logos to telos. But the way that most Greek writers write is they write like this. So you get these logos to telos pieces that many times they'll drop, they'll come back, they'll drop, they'll come back, or one part will fulfill the next, will lead to the next, will lead to the next. And many times this is kind of formation we see. Especially in the Gospels, we notice this. But in Romans, we see this one part, this 8th chapter of Romans, which is all about pneuma. Now, it's not to mean that Paul does not talk about pneuma again, but what we've done is we've led up to, in logical arguments, to this whole state of pneuma. And then Paul rounds out his argument, and remember, in a Greek document, normal Greek document, you don't list your telos. But Paul is writing to Romans, and Romans expect a telos. So look what he says at the end of this chapter. Now, remember, the chapters were added, but some wise guy, right, back in the day, when they added the chapters were added first, before verses. And when they added the chapters, what do you think they tried to break in it?
Segments.
Segments of logic, logical segments. And the guys who are writing or doing this originally, what do you think they were looking for? Logos to telos. And so it's interesting that we find a lot of the logos to telos fragments, pieces. When I say fragments, I mean these arguments that are cohesive arguments that are within them, they're self-cohesive, are broken into chapters. They're very interesting. In the Hebrew, they couldn't do that.
Chapters or verses?
Chapters. Yeah, the verses are an attempt to generally do either paragraphs or sentences. But remember, there's no paragraphs, there's no sentences. We don't know where they're broken and where they should be broken. And that causes a serious problem for us. Because originally, remember, how did they originally get this? It's mnemonic, so it's verbally. So everyone, like you would have memorized this whole thing, this whole book. You would have memorized this book before we even talked about it in Greek, right?
Even the New Testament's that way? I understood the Jews memorizing the scrolls from the Torah and everything else, but the New Testament letters were also originally mnemonics.
Yep. The only thing that they added that helps us, that's better than the Hebrew, is they added vowels. But they had no word spaces, no punctuation, nothing, because the speaker had already memorized it, the reader had already memorized it, and then the reader was able to since you memorized it, you knew where all the breaks were. You see? You knew those points. But when we turn them into the documents that we're used to, there's a continual fight to today. Where's the proper break for these words, for these statements, for these paragraphs, for these sentences? We don't know. And so in every translation, you'll find different places. Yeah.
So that gets back to the way the scribe would memorize how the person writing the letter, before they delivered it, they would practice and memorize how the writer intended it to be?
Yeah, with the person. And that's the way documents were passed on. Like I said, if you bought a book, remember the price of books is ginormous, So even at the discount prices that you'd find in Athens, so maybe you pay for an acre farm for a book rather than a 40-acre farm, right? for a scroll. So you'd buy your discount scroll, and you know what the guy would send with you? A slave. He would send a slave. Remember, Plato was a slave. And what did Plato do as a slave? He did exactly this. He memorized documents so that then when the seller sold you that scroll, you took the slave home with you. In fact, the slave probably carried your bags, right? And the slave carried it home, and guess what he did? He read it to you. See? And he would stay as long as it took. I mean, just think of the cost of these things, right? Okay, think about your house. That's the cost of a book at a discount. So $100,000 is what you're paying for this scroll. So, if they threw out in the slave, you're still making a profit, right? So the slave would stay as long as necessary for you to memorize that document. And then once you had it memorized, well, you could always get a refresher, right? I forgot what this scroll is, right? It didn't.
You kind of need to have a slave come with your mail every day. Get a lot of housework done.
There you go. Or remember in Athens, about 2/3 of the population of Athens were slaves. And matter of fact, in most remember, the world is a slave-based economy. The world is a slave-based economy until about 1830. So the world was slaves. In 1830, the world began to change. Before that, everything was slave-based. Remember the girl with the pearl? I love the girl with the pearl because that's a perfect example of slavery in, how was she a slave? You know what kind of slave she was, right? The girl with the pearl earring?
You're talking about the painting?
Yeah, the painting. She was a slave. Van Dyck was picturing a slave. You know how she was a slave? She was an indentured servant. Indentured servants were very common in Europe and very common in the United States until the end of slavery. And indentured servanthood still exists in almost every other culture except for Western cultures. Western cultures got rid of indentured servanthood because they see it as slavery. But the girl with the pearl earring in that movie, and as far as we know, was an indentured slave.
Weren't indentured servants kind of a short-term, kind of contractual thing? So you work for somebody for a certain amount of time, pay back the debt, and then you're on your own?
Yeah, that's the way it's supposed to work.
In theory, but...
In theory, but if you remember both the movie, and if you ever dig into this, it's kind of like, remember the complaints by the factory and mine workers back at the turn of the century that caused all the union movement to come into being, is because you owed your soul to the factory store, right? You would go to work, and that was a type of indentured servanthood. And by the way, it was common. No one saw it as a problem. Yeah.
That's the way it works, like in India and stuff. A lot of Christians end up working for brick makers or whatever, and they can never pay them back all that they borrowed, and so they end up as slaves for life.
Right.
One question on the documents of the New Testament were written in Greek.
Yes.
Do they still have scrolls that needed interpreted and all that by that time?
Well, remember first of all, I'll delve into this again because I always go over this, but it's always great. I haven't gone over this in about at least a bunch of classes. So remember that the reason that they invented books, and the original books were called codexes, was basically they took the scrolls and they cut them apart into pieces. Originally, the scrolls were pieces of individual paper that were, or papyrus, papyrus or vellum, that were stitched together into a scroll, because they started as individual pages. But that was inconvenient for finding your place, and inconvenient for finding, for reading stuff, and especially if you had multiple books in it. Because most scrolls, like for example the scroll of Isaiah, the scroll of, the Torah scroll would have the first 5, so it's hard to find where you want to go. So they invented the codex. In the codex, they cut the sheets apart again, and then bound them on the left or right hand side. In our culture, we bound them on the left hand side, so you open the book this way, which is very interesting because in most cultures that are mathematically based, you go from left to right. in most cultures that are not mathematically based, they're symbol based, like Hebrew, like Japanese, like Chinese. How do they go? Now, there is one non-symbol based, mathematically based language in the East. Anybody know what it is that goes left to right like we do? Korea. The Koreans invented the only other vowel-based language, vowel-based alphabet. The Greeks were the first. They also did it. So they did it independently. But they also read left to right. Greeks go left to right. We go left to right. It's mathematically based. So very interesting.
Just, well, you talked about, excuse me.
Go ahead.
By the time the New Testament was written, did they have to have a slave interpret it, or were they?
Oh, yeah.
not?
Oh, yeah.
They still had spaces and gaps.
No spaces.
But they still, because they probably didn't read Greek, huh?
Well, no, they did read Greek, but they're mnemonics. So when you wrote the Greek, there was no spaces. See, I put spaces here for you, right? There's no spaces. So it's like, you know, the brown fox leaped over the whatever wolf, you know, whatever.
Brown fox jumped
I can't
over the
remember
fence.
that, 'cause my brain is too screwed up this morning. But, you know, it would be all smooshed together. See, there'd be no punctuation, there's no spaces, because they're mnemonics. We only got out of the mnemonic stage around 600 to 800 AD.
Okay.
600 to 800 AD, probably the reason. What would be your conjecture of why we got out of the mnemonic stage? I think there's two reasons why we got out of the mnemonic stage. Can you guess?
More people becoming literate.
Printing press?
More people becoming literate is part of the thing. What's that?
Printing press?
That was late. That's there.
We were getting the printing press in 1400, but books were becoming more ubiquitous even before the printing press. The books, more ubiquitous among those who could read. The learn. They were getting libraries and other things. And the problem was that it became more and more difficult to memorize. Because if you memorize, let's say, 26 books, right? I don't think it was unusual for people to memorize. Well, we know they memorize LXX. So what's in LXX? What? Well, 37 plus the Apocrypha, right? So that's probably around 50-something works. You know, 50 total or about, right? So I don't think it would be unusual for someone to memorize maybe 50, and then you add the 26 of the New Testament, and then you add a lot of works of classic, and then you get to about 100 books.
Man.
100 works might be reasonable, but then you start getting beyond that, you know, you're just getting to the edge probably of human ability, right? And yeah, there are probably some people that could memorize maybe 1,000 books. I mean, that might be possible if they get their hands on it, right? But that's rare. So as more people became literate, they're like, well, this isn't working for me, right? Let's figure a better way. And so that's why they invented punctuation and spaces, and the books went from mnemonics to being self-sustaining. Yeah?
So even when people wrote a letter to someone else, it was all mushed together?
Yep.
But how, you know, if it's supposed to be a mnemonic device or someone who already knows what it says, how do you send a letter to someone who doesn't already know what it says?
You send a slave.
You haven't read it.
Always?
Always. Always.
Well, that says,
You don't have to go read it.
Send a slave along with
Messenger.
a letter to the.
That's all right. It always.
that means
Yeah.
that when you read the first 100, that person read his 100 books, someone had to read it to him the first time.
That's right. And it's ubiquitous. The world was ubiquitous with slaves. And, you know, well, remember, this is the other thing. What do you think most of the literate people did? Did they memorize this stuff themselves?
Yes.
You think?
Better now.
They have a slave read it to them.
No. I'd have my slave. You see, I'd have my slave that knows my Isaiah. Well, you know, if I were a Greek guy, I'd have my slave that had memorized, you know, certain things. Now, the Odyssey and the Iliad, I bet every single, you know, it's kind of like the Torah. I bet every single Greek that was literate had read or knew by heart the Odyssey and the Iliad. I guarantee you they did. Because that was one of their chief discussions, you know, when they got together, they discussed that. That was their thing, okay, in their world. And if you didn't know it, you were probably a barbarian, even if you were Greek, right? But just think, for all these other documents, you know, if you're really wealthy, hey, send me my Hermes slave, right? Because he had memorized the scroll of Hermes or whatever, right? A book. And so you get him to come and tell you, right? So you would basically have entertainment. See?
But memorization does not necessarily mean understanding. So, I mean, someone that didn't really know what it meant could recite that. I mean, a parrot can do that, so.
Yes, and the beautiful example of this, I'm glad you brought this up. Remember, the beautiful example of this is the eunuch that was reading the Isaiah scroll.
And he didn't know what it meant.
And he didn't know what it meant. Yeah. And see, what he had done is, remember, he went to Jerusalem, and he probably bought the scroll, and he had a slave that knew it, right? And he had memorized it. And remember, in the ancient world, you did not read, you always read aloud, right? So he's reading the scroll. This is how Philip knew that he was reading the scroll of Isaiah. Because he's in his chariot going along, you know, and he has a chariot driver, by the way. He wasn't driving and reading at the same time. You know? He's sitting in his chariot reading with his driver, and old Philip hears him. And, you know, he has memorized it, but he didn't know what it meant. See? This is really neat. Now, I want to also point out something else before we move along. Notice the proof text in John that the documents were written in Greek, and that Jesus spoke Greek, and that all the famous guys in the New Testament era spoke Greek. You remember what the proof is? What's the proof?
They spoke Aramaic, they didn't know.
Yeah.
Because Mary Magdalene, when she grabbed a hold of Christ, it says, she said in Aramaic, Rabboni. Now, why would you say that unless she's speaking some other language than Aramaic? You see? This blows me away that people think that all the documents were originally in Aramaic. That's just silly. Because there's so many markers that show us they were originally written in Greek. And that all the Greek, that Jesus spoke Greek, that all these guys spoke Greek, and gals.
Well, it wouldn't make any sense at all for it to all be in Aramaic if any of the Gentiles weren't to understand, right?
I would even go further. God did not, well, okay, this is a theological. God did not want it in Aramaic, he wanted it in Greek. Because Greek is such a concrete language, cut and dried language, that you can't miss it, right? Whereas we've seen Aramaic, well, Aramaic is very similar to Hebrew, but Aramaic and Hebrew are very squishy languages, very much like English.
Was Aramaic even a written language?
Yes, well, yeah, no, maybe so. It is, you know, matter of fact, parts of Daniel, most of Daniel and parts of, there's another one that are written in Aramaic, that are written in Aramaic. Yeah.
Real quick, and this may not have anything to, why would they go from right to left? And the reason why being a left-hander, when in penmanship, I'd always smudge because I'm dragging my hand across. I would assume that most people, even if they're writing the mnemonics, whatever they're doing, if they're going right to left, that they're right-handed for the most part. I would think you'd have the same, it doesn't seem logical.
In symbol-based languages, generally you go right to left.
So how do they not smudge is his question.
Because their writing is not like the writing we do. Their writing is generally, like for example, in the Japanese text, Japanese write down. And hieroglyphics can be written down and back. You can write either way. You can write this way, but you can also write down. And a lot of books in Japanese, of course, Japanese has 3 different ways of writing. You know, they have kanji and Roman. They write in the Roman, in our type text, but they also write kanji. And there's another one too. What's the other one?
The Chinese-based.
The Chinese-based.
You have another culture represented here, ties right from left to right.
And generally, cultures that are symbol-based cultures will write from right to left, where mathematically based cultures will write from left to right. And also, like I said, Koreans go from left to right, and they have symbol-based, or they're not symbol-based. They actually have a phonetic-based, where Chinese and Japanese are all symbol-based languages. Now the Japanese have a little more complex. Think what happened when the East and West met, and also the Koreans met with the Japanese. Really borrowed a lot of stuff. They so they saw, they originally had Chinese, but they really borrowed a lot from the Koreans. And so, like I said, the Koreans invented vowels just like the Greeks did. Yeah?
So what was the writing utensil that the Greeks used?
The Greeks used brushes and styluses, but they would write normally like we write, very similar to the way we write, where in other cultures, like for example in a symbol-based culture, the point is drawing the symbol. The symbol either represents a consonant vowel sound, or it represents, like for example in Chinese, it can represent a whole word sound. So, yeah, it is possible to do that, although I'm not versed. I wish I were more versed in Chinese kind of stuff. I know a little bit about Japanese, more familiar with Japanese and Korean, but like I said, that's not my expertise is Greek, so, try to stick in that. But anyway, see, where were we? Did we answer all the questions? We had some good questions, I thought.
Certainly have a flurry of them.
A flurry. Flurry is good. Anyway, let's see. Let me do the last part. Let me do the last two verses in Romans 8, because these are beautiful. These are the logos to telos. These are the telos of Romans. 38. For I am convinced, literally piteo, I am convinced by the logos, that neither Thantos nor Zoe, Thantos is death, nor Zoe life, nor angelos, angels, and it's not demons, it's arche, which can mean the chief priest, but arche is not demon. Neither the present, literally esteeming things at hand, nor the future, mellow, the expectation, nor any dunamis, miraculous power. 39. Neither height, and the word is hupsome, which means the heavens, nor bathos, literally profundity. Bathos, they translate depth, but it literally, remember, I think I've been through this before in Corinthians, when we studied either Corinthians or Ephesians. The words that are used, we take them, hupasoma, we take them to be measures, pure measures, but they're not pure measures. The word literally means the heavens. The word bathos literally means profundity. So it's not just height, it's the heavens. It's not just depth, it's bathos, it's profundity of thought. Nor anything else in all creation, literally katesis. Katesis is different than cosmos. And I really wish we'd translate this better. But remember, you have the plenum of everything with God in it. And then you have, this is the cosmos. Cosmos is everything that God created. And then you have the katesis. And the katesis includes everything. You have the philosophia that man can know, and then you have the empirical universe. So everything's within that. But the cosmos is the word that means everything that's within creation. Katesis is a more limited word. So in other words, even those things which could separate you are like the things that are within, that are created, or that can't separate you. Those things that are anything in creation that will be able to put room between, literally chorizio, put room between us and the agape, the love of the gods of God that is in Jesus Christ our Lord. So the reason I want to reemphasize this is because this is that telos of the Spirit. So Paul writes and says, remember, the whole point of Romans is to prove to the Romans in the Logos to Telos that this Christ and this God guy are applicable to them. And then he says, okay, the Spirit is the, he says that you have this diokosune, you have this righteousness because you are convinced. But then he goes on to say, But how do you do right? Because that's the whole point to the Romans. How do you continue to do right? And he says the answer is through the Spirit. And so that's the end. And his end point is that once you have done this, once you have accepted this because you are convinced, and that's his point. For I am convinced, patheo, of the Logos. And it goes through all this thing. So that's the end point.
Would another word for, is it catesis or cathesis?
Catesis.
Would be that which man is aware?
It could be. Matter of fact, philosophia probably would include this, everything that man can know. Because obviously things,
Can know or does know?
can know. Philosophia is everything that man can know. But catesis is just a more limited than cosmos. It's interesting that the word that was used was not cosmos. It was catesis. But, catesis is literally the created things. Where cosmos is everything that was created. Yeah, I know. Okay, why the Greeks would see different? But look, words are important, right? And every word is important. Okay.
Why would you choose one over the other?
Why choose? Well, in English, we have a lot of words that are synonymous, right? Or that are synonyms that we just throw them around glibly. But in Greek, you don't have enough words to do that. These words are very specific. And I should go into more detail on that, but I'm not gonna. I'm going to look at the words of the day, because these are really fun words that I know you guys will really like. Epaggelias. And remember, this is epagelion, epagelio, but epagelias that's the form we find if you're looking at your interlinear text. So this is in what we're seeing. But epagelio is the primary. It comes from a preposition, and you guys know, you can figure this out. This is epi, like epidural, and this is agelo, like messenger, right? Exactly. The reason this is I think this is very important, is because literally this means a message or an announcement from the gods. Yeah. So this is a messenger. This is a message from the gods. Epagelion. So we will see this. It is translated, I think, kind of improperly as a message. This is like we secularize these words, which is very interesting. But in any case, you won't see it lose any. It just has a lot of force. The message of the gods. This word is one of your probably favorites. Eklogen, and it's ekloge, which ekloge. Well, let's see. Ek is a preposition meaning, action proceeded out from, whatever, from, and logo, this is what? Logos. You know that one. Logos. So here's your logos, your logical argument. So proceeding out of a logos, an ek logos, is a choice. A choice based on logic. We translate it election or chosen. So you are the elect, right? Why are you chosen?
Because you were
Selected. You persuaded someone.
Well, you're chosen because of logic. And we get the word election from this. We choose, hopefully, because I mentioned this last week, right? Ekologi, you choose because of logic, right? You make a choice.
Would that be a decision then versus a guess?
In English, we have lots of words that we can use, right? And it's interesting that we chose the word election because it is close to election, but I like to draw it out a little bit more and say a choice based on logic, right? You choose based on logic. So when we say, if I just say God chose, in English there's no basis. Why did he choose, right? But if I say this in Greek, that it's an ekloge, eklogos, right? Ekloge,
Logical choice.
then he made a logical choice. And that puts it into a really different fundamental point, right?
Takes emotion out of it.
If we're gonna stay with the logos.
Okay?
Why wouldn't persuaded be better than election? Because you were persuaded through logic, but that meant that you, and maybe this is just my English background, but persuaded means that someone convinced me through, I mean, it could be through logic, but I can be persuaded with something other than logic. Many times our children are persuaded not through logic, but because they don't want the alternative of doing something that they.
I wouldn't worry about that, because patheo is always used of us making a choice, patheo being convinced. This is used almost exclusively of God. So we'll see that in the context, but I wouldn't worry about it, because it won't come up in a human context. Not that it's a sacred word. It's not a Greek sacred word. It could be used of people, but it's not used in that context. Let's see, this one. Oh, you guys will love this one. Sklereni. Let's see if I can pronounce it. Probably not. The form is sceleruno. Okay, sceleruno from sceleros. The base is literally, this is to indurate. Anybody want to tell me what indurate means?
Mr. Englishman?
To make hard
Come
like
on, Steve,
stone.
give us a chance here.
To harden, to make hard like stone, literally, okay? And figuratively, this means to make stubborn, right? But we are going to see this in context. I hope we get to this, because in the verses, because this really bothers people. I remind you of Pharaoh, because that's the example. But this bothers people because they don't understand the context. And if you remember that we're talking about Sark, Suke, and Pneuma here. We'll get to there when we get to explain what I'm saying, what I'm talking about. This final word here, T-R-E-C-H-O-T-O-S. Let's see, can I pronounce that? Trecho. Literally meaning to, the reason I bring this word up as a word of the day is because this word means to run or walk quickly. And the context that it's used in, let's just say that it's translated kind of funny, because although it says that in the King James, have course and run, it's translated NIV in a really funny way, but we'll see that. So let's look at 9. And remember, the whole point of this, don't lose the perspective, that the point of Romans is to prove to the Romans, using a logos to tell us, that this Jesus Christ stuff, this God and this Jesus Christ stuff is applicable to them. Because remember, they're pantheonic pagans who believe that gods are limited by space and city-states, and that's what they do. So when you're in the city-state, you believe that God. So they want to know, does this God and does this Jesus Christ guy apply to us? And that's the whole question. So we've been through this before. The last one we looked at was, how can you be right? And remember, the answer that Paul gave was pneuma. And so now he is going to answer another question. Should I give you the question he's going to answer before we get to it? Will that help? Or will that hurt? Here's the question. And if you keep this in context, you'll understand exactly where we're coming from. Why did God not make us Jews? Why did God not make us Jews? Do you see how this question falls out? Probably not, but this is where Paul gets to. The point is that okay, if I have convinced you, because that's what it is, right? A patheos. I've convinced you. That what? This applies, right? That this God guy, this Jehovah, Yahweh, this God applies not just to the Hebrews, not just to the Greeks, but also to the Romans, right? That's what I proved to you. And I proved to you that this Jesus Christ, right, from the beginning of time, this Jesus Christ was supposed to do this thing, and if you believe in the Yahweh who raised this Jesus Christ from the dead, which is not in dispute at this point, at this time, that it gives you benefits. And the benefits that he pointed out was this pneuma, right? So the next question the Romans have, now maybe you don't have this question, but I bet your kids have had this question. The next question is, well, why didn't God make us Jews to begin with, right? Because if we were Jews to begin with, then what?
We would have had this knowledge all along.
That's right, we would have had all this knowledge all along. And look, what is the most important thing to the Greeks and the Romans? To the Greeks specifically? Knowledge. And to the Romans who are appropriating this knowledge from the Greeks, it's important stuff, because what did the Romans do with the knowledge? They apply it. See, the Greeks had all these great ideas, but didn't apply it. And the Romans borrowed all this great stuff from the Greeks, and what did they do with it? They built aqueducts, right? It's not enough to think about pneumatic stuff. It's like, well, why don't you build an aqueduct, right? And that way you have water all the time. And the Greeks go, that's cool, you know?
Build a
But
line.
Lionel, again, going back to the Romans and the Greeks both,
Mm-hmm.
most of the Jews rejected it. So
No.
why would they want to be Jewish?
I disagree with that. That is not true biblically nor historically. Most of the Jews did not reject it. As a matter of fact, we note that it says specifically in Acts that at least 20,000 people out of 100,000 in Jerusalem were Teen Hodos.
Well,
which-
that's 20%.
Became a major movement.
Well,
I'm
at
not
least.
disputing that.
At least. And, you know, the point is that at least, you know, and this is what, how many years? Less than 10 years after the after the death and resurrection of Christ. So, if I told you that New York City, you know, which would be the equivalent of an ancient city like, you know, in that time, that New York City, that a fifth of the population in New York City were Teen Hodos, had accepted this Teen Hodos thing.
And most were not.
No. That is the measure we have. We know that because from Acts. But we know that, for example, most of the priests became members of Teen Hodos. We just know at that point they were. But when Paul spoke, we know that it says specifically of both the Jews and the Greeks. Some believed, some said we want to hear more about this, and some didn't. But at least that's thirds. But in no case does it say that they didn't listen. As a matter of fact, all we hear in the Acts is they were listened, they accepted, and then what happened? There were groups that came from Jerusalem to do what? To stomp it out, right? Just like Paul tried to stomp it out. When Paul tried to stomp it out, what happened? He got converted. So, you know, I dispute this. It has become a popular view of culture that it can't be proven historically. Right? Historically, we know what happened. When the fall of Jerusalem, what happened to the priests? We know this historically. Couldn't be found. There are no priests. Why? Acts tells us that many of the priests came members of Teen Hodos. And so, there weren't any priests anymore. Why? Because they become Teen Hodos. You know? It's only after the fall of Jerusalem, actually 125 AD, that we start to see the resurgence of Jewish thought. And by the way, the resurgence of Jewish thought is the opposite of what it was. Because what happened in 125 AD? It was the Great Revolution, the Greek Revolution, or the Jewish Revolution. Who was it? Yeah, you always remember the name. What's his name again? Yeah. That was, you remember, Jerusalem was attacked by Nero originally, and then Nero croaked, but, you know, continued on after him and fell in 70 AD. But then after that, in 125 AD, there was another revolt by the Jews. But literally, remember, you have the 5 sects of Judaism, and Teen Hodos was taken over. It was only after, basically, Christianity became affiliated again as a Regio Legitis, that you see the world change for Teen Hodos, Christianity. So, I don't know. You cannot prove the assertion that there were very few Jews that accepted.
I didn't say very few. I said there were more that rejected than accepted.
I would disagree with that too. I would say that what you see is you saw an incredible flow of Jewish thought that the Jews attempted to squelch. And by the way, you know why there was an attempt by Christians and Jews to squelch this, right? Well, a real problem was persecution of Christians by Jews and others in the early church, right? There was huge persecution going on. So the Jews afterwards did not want to be affiliated with persecution of the Christians. And then afterwards the Christians did persecute Jews, right? And then the Christians have not wanted, I mean, I don't think even today a lot of Christians want to be affiliated with Judaistic thought, which is silly in my opinion, because, you know, that's the basis of Christianity. It comes out of Judaistic thought, Tin Hodos. So the Christians didn't necessarily want to be affiliated with Jewish thought, and the Jews didn't want to be affiliated with Christian thought. So, you know, it's kind of a mutual thing, so let's write our history, right? And the history we've written is, oh, not many Jews converted, right? Which I think is totally incorrect, because it started as what kind of movement? It's all Jewish, right? They didn't even let non-Jews in, right? There's an exclusive club for a while. So, I don't know, you know, I think there's more proof that it was ubiquitous in the Jewish world, that a lot of Jews, you know, just like Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. What happened to the Essenes, guys? If you got Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots, we know what happened. What happened to Sadducees? Acts tells us. Sadducees were the priests. What did they do? They became Tin Hodos. What happened to the Essenes?
Assimilated, totally.
The Essenes were assimilated probably into Christianity. They became Tin Hodos very quickly. They were already disassociated with the Sadducees. What happened to the Pharisees? Pharisees were probably the largest group and controlled the synagogues.
They're the present Orthodox.
They probably continued as present Orthodox. And then the Zealots. What happened to Zealots? You know what happened to Zealots? Masada. They got crowed. Yeah. Yeah. They were toasted. So out of the 5 sects of Judaism, the one that was probably the most prevalent was Tin Hodos and the Pharisees. And guess what we see today? We see the Pharisees, which are represented by the current, you know, there's 3 groups in Judaistic thought today, but, you know, those are mostly Pharisaic from synagogue, and you also see Tin Hodos, which is Christianity. Yes, sir.
An interesting thought, and it's a book I've kind of been reading on Jewish culture and customs. They make a comment here that there's a Jewish position that the law was offered to all people, and only the Jews accepted it, which goes back to your comment is, you know, why Jews? But it was offered to all people by God, but only the Jews accepted it. If you go back and thought, of course, Noah could be considered then a Jew under said philosophy. So you have the righteous line that became the 12 tribes.
I don't know. There's a lot of interesting things that happened Talmudically, you know, to Jewish thought after Christianity, because they had to reestablish, especially after the destruction of Jerusalem and the 125, you know, revolt. So we've discussed it. Let's get into chapter 9. Okay, chapter 9.
Chapter 9.
1. I speak aletheia. I speak not false. Remember, you can prove a not false, can't prove a true. So in Greek, it's always a not false. I speak aletheia, not false, in Christ. I am not pseudodomai, uttering an untruth. My conscious sunnidesis, my co-perception, confirms, literally, summaterio. It jointly testifies in the hagios pneuma. Now, by the way, you notice that the scholars broke this from the previous chapter, right? But this sure sounds like it fits in chapter 8. Because it goes on, but it says, 2. I have great lupe, sadness, and unceasing anguish, literally odune, grief, sinking down in my cardia, in my heart, in my cardia. 3. For I could wish, literally, ekomai, pray. And this is interesting. What's the other word that's usually translated pray? Eucharisto. Eucharisto. I could, okay, when I say in Greek, oikomai, Oikomai means to pray. Eucharisto means to pray when? Before a meal.
Eucharist.
And becomes Eucharist, yeah, Eucharist. So it's very interesting that, for example, in English, we want to translate these words the same, but they have very, very specific meanings in Greek. But oikomai, I pray that I myself were cursed, anathema, literally religiously banned, and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, those of my own katasarks, literally katasarks, my own, they translate it race, but it's katasarks, meaning my whole flesh, literally in the flesh. This is an irony. Why is this an irony? Why is this an irony out of Paul's lips? What have the Jews done with Paul? They have already cut him off. Now, they didn't totally cut him off because he felt safe enough to go back to Jerusalem to do his, do due diligence with some sacrifices, right? But when he writes this, how is he held by a lot of the Jewish people? The Pharisaic Jews especially. Remember, it's unfair, and I agree with, for example, Stern talks about, it's really unfair to basically lump Jews as Jewish people, for example, because really we're talking about 5 sects of Jewish thought: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and Teen Hodos. And so Paul is accepting of Teen Hodos, but he's got problems with the Pharisees, really, not the Sadducees so much. The Sadducees are very supportive of this Teen Hodos, right? The guys that were unhappy with Teen Hodos were the Pharisees, right? Not the Sadducees. Because these Teen Hodos guys were sacrificing in the temple like crazy. So if you're a priest, what happens when people are sacrificing in the temple?
Food.
Yeah, you're eating well. Okay, it's like my family was starving. Now I'm eating well, right? So you're happy. The Pharisees were the guys who were upset. Remember, Paul was originally a Pharisee. But the Pharisees controlled the synagogues. They controlled the learning and teaching in synagogues. And so, by the way, we know what happened Talmudically to Paul. Paul's mentioned in the Talmud. He who shall not be named. It's pride of Voldemort. This guy was Voldemort, literally, in the Talmud. They call him, he shall not be named. The nameless one. Because they took his name and pulled it out. He made some really, really reasonable arguments as, what's his name's? The Rabbi of Rabboni of Rabbonis. What's his name? Gamaliel. He had made arguments with Gamaliel that were accepted Talmudic arguments. And so Paul was, before he became part of Teen Hodos and was kind of like thrown to the wolves, he was very accepted by the community. But this is an irony because he was cut off. Not from Christ, but from his people, at least those who were in control at the time. He was trying to get them to come to the good side, so to speak. And his audience knew this. They knew this. They knew this about him because before there had been problems in Rome.
Yeah, very much so.
In 4, the people of Israel, this was a continue, the people of Israel. Theirs is the adopted, and see, here's a problem, okay? Where should this, they're trying to break verses by thought, right? By sentences or thoughts. Well, they didn't break this one right, so how is it to be read properly? See? And I didn't try to parse that part, but anyway. The people of Israel, theirs is the adoption of sons. Theirs is the divine glory, doxia, the covenants, literally the diatheke, the disposition, the receiving of the law, the nomothista, the legislation, literally, the temple, temple's added, by the way, worship and the promises. So theirs was all this stuff.
Lionel, was Paul very unusual to be a Pharisee and a Roman citizen?
I think so.
Is this not something that the Pharisees that were not I mean, didn't that put him in a category of suspicion? Sideline? I mean, that was always interesting. Why was he a Roman citizen?
I suspect that what happened, remember, what we find historically is if you look at a lot of cities in the ancient world, you'll find that there is in the marketplace or close to the marketplace an area that the Jews basically had marked out as a place. And you find that Jewish groups, and what happened is a lot of these, for example, the marketplace, let's say in the temple area, I mean, I'm going to try to explain this as well as I can. The Jews did what in the ancient world? And the modern world too, but in the ancient world especially, were involved in what? Trade. Yeah, they were trading guys. They did a lot of trading and money, currency kind of stuff, especially after the advent of currency. And so what you see in the ancient world is you find that Jewish conclaves were built very close to the marketplace, or that they built the Jewish conclave, let's say, at the edge of the city. And what happened? The marketplace either moved there, or the city came to absorb them. And by the way, what's next to the marketplace in what's next to the marketplace in every Greek city? The temple. Yeah, the temple, because that's where you sacrifice the meat, and that's where you got the meat from. So, very interesting that you see around a lot of the large cities these Jewish enclaves. And by the way, they wanted the Jews there, but remember, if you moved to a city-state, what did you have to do? You had to worship their gods. Well, you basically, when you did this, the Jewish people would negotiate a point. They negotiate a thing. Then what?
Nobody would bother them about their worship.
Yeah, they would, and so you would see, remember the Warsaw Ghetto existed prior to the Nazis forcing them into the Warsaw Ghetto, right? Why was there a Warsaw Ghetto? The same reason that there was a ghetto in New York City where the Jews lived, right? Because they created communities where they had their synagogues and where they had their own worship. And the same thing's true in the ancient world. And they actually got away with it. Why?
Because they were provide.
They needed them as for trading function and for currency functions in the city-states. Yeah. And so what you find is you find these enclaves, Jewish enclaves, that happen to be near the marketplace and interestingly by the temples, or at least usually across from them. And you see this in almost every ancient Greek city-state.
You see it everywhere today.
Yeah.
Cultures tend to, whether it's Korean, whether it's still Jewish, whether it's Chinese, whether it's Lebanese, you see these all over the world. You see these enclaves. They're very specialized in what service they provide.
Yeah.
Whether it's lending, whether it's certain diamonds, whatever expertise that culture has had, it still exists today.
And although it's not as important, for example, in a melting pot like our country where people are really free pretty much, and you don't have to form these enclaves for protection, but you see in other countries, for example, where they do build enclaves for protection. They have to be, because there's a lot of danger, involved with, not worshiping the way that other groups worship, especially in the ancient world. And so you find this, this is where you find Jewish infiltration into the communities. And so Paul's father, Paul came from Tarshish. Tarshish is in Turkey and in a Greek-controlled area, right? That was originally controlled by the Greeks, the Seleucid Empire. And so Paul's father probably did what? Or Paul maybe bought his citizenship so he could be a trading partner with Rome. That's who you want to be a trading partner with. And if you had a Roman citizenship, and I picture this in my book, in Centurion, remember the guy who was the trading guy in this, if you've read the book, there's a trader who trades for the legions in the legion camp. And he's the one that's authorized to trade with the legions. He's a Roman citizen. And so he trades with the legionnaires. And he sells them things. And he's been given a imprimatur, to be able to trade with the legion and even be on the legion thing, because he's a Roman citizen. See? So if Paul's a Roman citizen and he's a trader, then what can he do? he can trade directly with the Romans, see, instead of going through secondary sources. Now, I show this in my book all the time, because a big problem that they have is, what kind of money did the Romans get?
Trade goods.
Roman money. No, they had Roman money. And how good's that going to do you in Jerusalem?
Temple money.
You got to have Jewish money, because by the way, the Jews aren't going to touch the Roman money, or they're not supposed to. Why? It's got an imago on it. It's got a picture of the emperor on it. So if I take a denarius, whether it's a Greek or Roman, coin, and I try to pay a bill in Jerusalem, what's a Pharisee going to do? Sadducee might even do the same thing, right? So, because you can't touch it. See? So, there's a lot in this. It's huge. So, Paul's a Roman citizen. It gives him a lot of power, especially if he came from a trading family. We don't know the background of his family very well. I did have some data on this, because Irenaeus or somebody, actually there is a record of Paul talking in a non-biblical. There's a record of him talking to a group in a non-biblical thing. I'll try to go look that source up for next week, but it's very interesting in that context. Anyway, okay, we're working on 9. We had some pretty fun stuff from 8. And good questions, always good questions. But thank you, Father, for this day. We thank you for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We pray that you look at this week. In your name we pray, amen.
So Lionel, if his father